Hey everybody, welcome to the morning's entertainment. Thanks for coming, really excited to be here. So I'm, I think, part of the rarest breed of Hertz Fellows, which is that I'm a geologist. And I think there's something like 2.5 to 3.5 of us, depending on how you count, over the last 15 to 20 years. But my research focuses on rivers, and when this loads in a second, you'll see a cool picture of an orange river in Alaska. And rivers really aren't supposed to be orange. But rivers aren't just like this phenomena of an orange river. It's not just isolated to this particular setting, but a lot of the surface waters in the Arctic are currently turning orange. So in the next couple of minutes, what I want to tell you about is why these rivers are orange, how we study them, and what those orange rivers mean for fluxes of elements that we care about. So things like carbon, sulfur, nitrogen. And I tried to make a pretty broad talk, but I'm hoping that you'll interrupt me with questions or save them for the end. So let's start with a really big question. Why are planets habitable? And how is it that biogeochemical cycles interact to sustain habitable conditions? So I'd like to motivate this problem with this model result from Berner and Caldera in 1997. So the y-axis on this plot is atmospheric CO2, and the x-axis is model time. And these two curves show results for when the carbon inputs to the atmosphere are out of balance with the carbon outputs. So the blue line is a 25% excess in CO2 uptake, and the red line is a 25% excess in CO2 degassing, so a carbon source to the atmosphere. And what you can see here is that on a timescale of only about 1 million years, even this modest imbalance can dramatically destabilize the carbon cycle. So if you have too much carbon uptake, CO2 collapses, and you can attain what's called the snowball Earth condition, where the oceans freeze. Conversely, if you have too much CO2 degassing, CO2 in the atmosphere builds up, and you can get a runaway greenhouse, like what happened on the planet Venus. So what we need is a negative feedback mechanism that can stabilize Earth's surface conditions against perturbations to the carbon cycle. And in a canonical view, the negative feedback that does that stabilization is the dissolution of rock at Earth's surface. So that process is represented by this equation. And what I'm hoping you can see here is that gaseous CO2 from the atmosphere is interacting with this calcium silicate mineral, dissolving that rock and producing silica and calcium while converting gaseous CO2 into aqueous bicarbonate. So by dissolving rocks, CO2 is removed from the atmosphere and that greenhouse gas forcing is no longer felt. So we call that process chemical weathering. And this operates as a negative feedback because when CO2 gets too high, the planet warms, temperatures go up, and this reaction proceeds further. And conversely, when the temperature is lower than the steady state condition, CO2 builds up in the atmosphere until this reaction is restored to equilibrium. Now, conventionally, this is supposed to be the weathering feedback that stabilizes climate. And this reaction also underlies enhanced rock weathering. So dissolving rocks is actually $1 billion industry. So these are 6 companies that are all trying to intentionally and artificially accelerate the weathering of rock to convert gaseous CO2 into aqueous bicarbonate. And Monte Carbon, this one in the top left, just won $50 million from the Musk Foundation specifically for carbon removal. So raise your hand if you've heard of these companies. Raise your hand if you're invested in one of these companies. Good, that's good, because there's real problems here. So this technology is really promising. The idea is to put basalt on agricultural fields and convert CO2 into bicarbonate. But the challenge is that there are also a lot of chemical weathering reactions that don't remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And one of these reactions that I'm really interested in is sulfide oxidation. So here's the reaction for sulfide oxidation. And in this reaction, the mineral pyrite, so iron sulfide, donates electrons to dioxygen, either in the atmosphere or in solutions, and produces sulfate. It also produces iron oxide, which is the mineral hematite, and it converts bicarbonate back to CO2. So this reaction has the reverse effect on the carbon cycle as silicate weathering does. And that means we're in trouble, right? Because I was saying that that other reaction, silicate weathering, is supposed to be the feedback that stabilizes climate. But these are reactions that destabilize climate. They can increase CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, while this particular reaction of sulfide oxidation probably doesn't occur in an ERW context, analogous reactions from clay formation do. But what I want to talk about is where we can see this reaction of sulfide oxidation in nature. So here are 2 images of the same site in Alaska in 2017 and 2018. This is from a paper published last year. And in 2017, it looks like a normal river, and in 2018, the river is orange. So that orange color is hematite. That's that iron oxide. So that's forming secondary to sulfide oxidation. So what this orange staining tells us is that chemical weathering in that system is increasing CO2. It's going the opposite direction of what weathering is supposed to do. So at this point, what I hope you can understand is that chemical weathering matters for carbon fluxes, and that the relative importance of different weathering reactions is changing through time. So how do we actually study these weathering reactions? So the key thing to note is that when reactions happen, the chemical products are put into surface waters. So different weathering reactions will have different characteristic ionic or isotopic contributions to the solute load of rivers. And I'm going to show you that using the example of sulfide and sulfate. So if we think about sulfate in surface fluids, we could sort of think about it deriving from two end members. One is this reduced pyrite end member, and the other is the oxidized gypsum end member, where gypsum is a calcium sulfate. Now, isotopically, sulfide tends to be very light in sulfur isotopes. It has a very low sulfur 34 to sulfur 32 ratio, and the reason for that is that it's forming secondary to a highly fractionating process of dissimilatory microbial sulfate reduction. In contrast, the sulfate, the oxidized form of sulfur, is actually residual to that microbial process, so it ends up with a higher sulfur 34 to sulfur 32 ratio. So if we measure the sulfur 34 to 32 ratio in river waters, we can diagnose which weathering reactions are occurring. And then by sort of thinking a little bit more about the broader context of these weathering fluxes, we can also understand the time scales over which these fluxes are impacting CO2. Because counterintuitively, the same exact dissolved chemistry can have one impact on CO2 on short time scales and a different impact on CO2 over long time scales. So there's also time scale dependence in the interpretation of dissolved solute chemistry. So where do we study these things? Right? So this summer, I was on the Adigan River catchment for about 2 weeks. So this is a map of Alaska. The mountains in the north of Alaska are called the Brooks Range. Most of the center of Alaska is the Yukon River catchment, but the Adigan is a small catchment that drains north into the Arctic Ocean, and this drains the oil shales that feed Prudhoe Bay. And just as a reminder, shales are sedimentary rocks. They tend to form in very quiescent environments. They end up very rich in sulfide and organic carbon. Here's a picture of the Adigan. This is a fairly small river as far as these things go, so we're really using it to study processes rather than global fluxes. You know, we're not trying to say this river matters for the carbon cycle, we're trying to use this river to study the chemical weathering processes. And for scale, you can see there's a guy over here, that's Mark Dumont, he's about 6'2", and he's a geophysicist from Colorado Mines. And then just for context, remember, rivers move through times. They migrate across their floodplains. So if you came back in a few years, this river is currently eroding on the side that the photo is taken from, and it's depositing sediment on the inner bend. So you know, if you came back later, this meander would essentially have been squeezed out a little bit towards us. This is a little bit what it's like to do fieldwork in Alaska. These are just some images of me. So the top left one, I'm collecting suspended sediment. This is using an instrument called the Van Dorn. It's just a cylinder with 2 trap doors on either side. So you stick that in the river and trigger the doors to shut, and then we collect that water and filter it to get at the suspended sediment load. The top middle one, we're measuring the velocity of the river, and you measure that along a whole series of points, and then you can calculate the discharge of the river and relate that to the sediment that you've measured using the Van Dorn. Top right, I'm just measuring sort of basic hydrochemistry, so things like pH, conductivity, DO, using a multimeter. These multimeters are fairly expensive, so this is actually a partnership that we're starting to develop with a company called YSI. So we're doing some promotional materials for them in exchange for they loaned us this unit for a couple of months. Bottom left, this is a drilling rig that we brought out for the first time. It's a backpack drill, so you can actually carry it out and drill several meters down into bedrock. So we did that for the first time this season, and what was cool is that you normally need to sort of use water to cool the drill, but because we were drilling into permafrost, there was enough ice that just the melting ice was able to cool the drill. And then bottom right, I'm sampling for dissolved carbon isotopes. And the way that you do that is you inject river water into a vial filled with phosphoric acid and helium, and then any carbon that's in the river water, it essentially just immediately converts to CO2, and then back in the lab, we can sample that for CO2 isotopes. Okay, so once we have samples, what do we do with them? Well, I'm currently in the process of building out a new lab. So I'm starting a low-temperature stable isotope lab at Woods Hole this fall. And geology labs are kind of funny, because you don't necessarily think that the dirt has to be clean, but we actually do work in clean labs. So this is less clean than a semiconductor lab, but it's still sort of class 1000, ISO 5. So you're still wearing bunny suits. And essentially that's because there's just not that much lithium or strontium in a lot of this material. So you have a cool problem of needing to get dirt from the environment into a really clean space. So we have stages. So this lab is going to have a sediment lab, it'll have a clean lab, and then it'll have a mass spectrometry room as well. So I spent most of the last few months designing this space, working with contractors, dealing with the budgets. But if you're ever in Cape Cod, please come over. I'd love to show it to you. All right, and then we're also going to be the sort of how do we make these measurements? Right? How do you actually measure stable isotope ratios? So conventionally, you would use what's called a sector instrument, which is a big magnet, and that physically separates ion beams. What we're going to be doing instead is investing in a new type of instrumentation called electrospray orbitrap. So this is kind of standard fare for proteomics. So maybe if you're in a biology lab, you probably have one of these. But geology labs don't. And in proteomics, what they're used for is studying really large molecules. And that's because they have extremely high mass resolution. So if you have molecules with extremely similar masses and you want to resolve them, you need very high ability to sort of do that resolution. But if you take that way down in the mass range to something that weighs like 100 mass units, like sulfate, you can actually resolve isobaric interferences. So you can see between sulfate forms that would have canonically the same mass. So think about like an O17 substitution in sulfate versus sulfur-33 substitution. And the way that you get these really high resolutions is by rather than putting a big magnet in the way of sort of your ion beam, you trap your ions in a spindle, and the movement of those ions gets recorded as a current. You can take a Fourier transform of that current. And what that opens up is the ability to measure isotopologues that have really never been measured before. So we're going to go after sort of isotopic forms that have never been observed, but that should have new information about chemical processes. So things like sulfate that has a sulfur-34 and an O18 substitution, or phosphate that has two O18 substitutions, things that have never before been able to be measured. And then I would be remiss if I didn't show a little bit of data. So I wanted to put together a couple different themes, right? So we talked about chemical weathering, talked about making these measurements, the impacts of weathering on CO2. So this is the newest figure that I made. The x-axis is time. So this is data from historical samples collected by the United States Geological Survey and the equivalent of Canada. It's data from the Yukon River. And then the y-axis here is the change in the crossed PCO2 contours due to chemical weathering. So you can think about that as the impact of chemical weathering on CO2, or the burden of chemical weathering on the ocean-atmosphere system. And what I've done is deconvolve that weathering impact into two components, one being a magnitude of weathering and one being an efficiency of weathering. So the magnitude is shown in blue. So this just says as the Yukon River system is thawing, as these rivers are turning orange, you're doing more weathering. And what that would do, all else being equal, is draw CO2 down. However, the weathering efficiency is going down. So if all you thought about was efficiency, that green line, you would conclude that weathering is actually increasing CO2. And people have argued both sides of this. What the black line, though, shows is the balance. And there's no trend there. So the idea here is that the impact of permafrost thaw, at least in the Yukon catchment, but also in the Mackenzie and in the Peel, is essentially neutral. There has not to date yet been any impact on PCO2 from inorganic chemical weathering. Okay, and then the next step is that we're going to try to go to the Brooks Range. So the Adigan, I showed you where that was, right? It was just sort of right at the mountain pass, but this is much further down where the mountains are better developed. And the challenge here is that you really need helicopters. So the idea of this project would essentially be to helicopter to a dozen different sites and sample dissolved chemistry, sediment chemistry, and a lot of these rocks. So you can kind of see that these are the shales on the left here. These are kind of the shales that are just full of pyrite and organic matter. Okay, so just to kind of wrap things up, the carbon cycle is extremely sensitive to flux imbalances. And chemical weathering reactions can both add or remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and I'm interested in the balance of those reactions. It's clear that that balance is changing in permafrost river systems, and we want to use isotopic tools to understand those reactions. New analytical tools, new ways of doing mass spectrometry and measuring stable isotope ratios are going to allow us to access new avenues of information into those chemical processes. And then there's many more field trips and measurements to come. I've actually been in the East River, which is about 4 hours west of here, for the last week, and I'm heading back there on Monday. So I have with me a bunch of sampling gear that folks said that, last night that they might like to see. So during the break, if you want to just come see some of the stuff that we use to sample rivers, like the multimeter, the syringes, and the filters, you're welcome to do so. So happy to take questions.
Okay, so could you go back to that slide of the companies that are involved here?
I think I may no longer have access to my slides. It looks like we've switched to a new slide deck.
Well, it's a very simple question. Which of those companies are you invested in?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's a tough one. Essentially, because I started doing a little bit of consulting for one of these guys, and the challenge is they're not really quantifying clay formation all that well yet. And like that is a huge alkalinity sink, right? So if you can weather all of this basalt, and you can then go sort of go to the surface and measure you can see that cations have left the basalt, right? And that you've added alkalinity to the system, but you don't actually know that that alkalinity is doing work on the carbon cycle, because you can take that back up through secondary processes that a lot of companies aren't measuring yet. So it's just sort of an accounting issue that's not been worked out yet. So I can't recommend a specific company. I would say go for the one measuring lithium isotopes to track clay formation. I don't know if I'm allowed to call on people.
Testing. So I know you're in northern Alaska, in the middle of nowhere, but nevertheless, there's still some human activity up there. How were you able to ascertain that none of this was influenced by human activity?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's constantly a problem. For the sulfur cycle, we're a little bit lucky in that like humans emitted so much sulfur pollution in the 90s that with the Clean Air Act, the anthropogenic input is pretty much going down. And that's really well documented, especially in sort of like the shaly regions of the world. So if you have a sulfate signal going up, you can feel really good that that's not anthropogenic. There's actually a huge anthropogenic rhenium signal though. And that's a big problem because rhenium is used to track the oxidation of rock-bound organic carbon. So the sulfide oxidation story is sort of an alkalinity problem. The rhenium is used to track a direct carbon input from the geologic reservoirs. So in that case, yeah, you do have to be really worried. The best work on that comes out of just atmospheric transport modeling of depositional fluxes. So you just say, I know this catchment area, I know roughly what the atmosphere is doing, so I can calculate the wet and dry deposition and then just subtract that from the observations.
This is perhaps loosely related. Have you may have heard of the studies recently that I think it was on the cover of Scientific American about a month ago, about the studies now of core geological samples in Greenland and studying the geology there, looking at climate history from that perspective, which your lab has sort of triggered my thoughts on that. But they basically have been studying ice cores for many years because it's a mile deep. Recently they decided what happens if we go a little deeper and go into the stone. And what they discovered is they were able to date periods in the history of Greenland where all that ice, a mile deep, was not there. There's periods of thaw where Greenland becomes a rock again. And they were surprised at how frequent it was and how recent it was and how cool of a global temperature was needed to do that. Are you familiar with that study at all, or do you have any comments? Okay. It's an interesting one because what was really scary is they expect 2 degrees from here, it's possible Greenland will have no ice. And Greenland with no ice is a 24-foot rise in sea level worldwide. So I just didn't know if the geology stuff, sounds like it's similar to the type of analysis your team is doing.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular work. I mean, there's certainly a lot of like nonlinear feedbacks where people talked a lot about these tipping points where sort of what is the change that's then required to get a massive change like melting all of Greenland. Yeah, these ice cores, they're kind of the gift that keeps on giving. We keep learning more and more about how to extract information from both the gas and the solids that make up the ice.
So I'm interested. So are these rivers, have they always been turning orange sometimes like this? Like, is there something new that's happening that's making them, all of a sudden this reaction's happening now?
Yeah, so it's definitely the case that rivers have always turned orange to some extent, right? So you think about like all you actually need to get this sort of hematite coating on bedrock is a lot of sulfide oxidation, and something like a big landslide, like a big mass wasting event, can easily expose a huge amount of pyrite or other sort of sediment, reduced sedimentary minerals that would source acidity. why is it happening now? We just know that permafrost is thawing, right? Like we can observe that permafrost is getting warmer. We can see the places that used to be continuous permafrost, so just like extensive subsurface frozen ground, are now discontinuous permafrost as well. So it's all just sort of part of this story, right? And when you go from 2017 to 2018 and you see a big change, and you don't see sort of a big geomorphic change associated with that, it's probably something about that surface sedimentary layer and the exposure of new minerals through thaw. So yeah, we just put in a proposal, the first proposal that I'm a PI on, to sort of do seasonal and decadal studies of active layer thawing. So sort of the change in the depth of seasonal thaw and how new minerals get into that surface weathering environment.
What work has the scientific community done to identify a more reasonable MRV regime for enhanced rock weathering?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's a measurement problem of not measuring enough things. So sort of, for example, just measuring the composition of the solid that's left over after weathering is not sufficient. You sort of need to also measure the downstream solute fluxes and the clay formation dynamics. But also, we're still trying to understand clay formation. So some of the work that I'm doing in the East River, for example, with lithium isotopes, is to understand sort of how it is that lithium gets fractionated. So fractionation just means lithium isotope discrimination, but sort of how you preferentially move, let's say, lithium-6 rather than 7 into different clays. And that'll have a first-order impact on the actual CO2 drawdown associated with ERW. So yeah, to answer that slightly differently, we're just doing first-order research, like first principles research into how weathering works before trying to, and that'll sort of have a direct translation into your ability to quantify CO2 drawdown through an application. Yeah.
Amazing talk. It's been a while since I worked on hematite, but I wanted to go back to the microbial part where you looked at the kinetic isotope effects on how they were. What about other microbe effects? Like oftentimes different changes in water chemistry can change the microenvironment, like what kind of microbes grow, and then hence that can do other reactions other than sulfur-related reactions. Like what's the order of magnitude comparison between the CO2 drawdown effects from chemical weathering versus changes in the microbiome that could affect the CO2 drawdown or emission?
Yeah, thanks, that's awesome. So the microbial dynamics are a little bit like a flywheel, right? Like you have just thousands of different bugs doing thousands of different reactions, constantly converting between a million different chemical forms. And when you go measure the rivers, it's kind of like, for the microbial dynamics to matter for the global carbon cycle, you have to build in some kind of reservoir of chemicals, right? So like if your floodplain is truly at steady state, then you have some chemical input, it gets cycled 100 million times, and then it just goes out, right? And you haven't actually done any work on the carbon cycle. So if you're working in a floodplain that's sort of actively accumulating sediment and like storing reduced carbon or reduced sulfur, then the microbial dynamics have like a first order impact right on the associated CO2 fluxes. The other thing that the microbes do that really matters is they alter the isotopic composition of what you're working on. So for example, microbial sulfate reduction has a strong preference for sulfur 32 relative to sulfur 34. So you leave sulfur 34 enriched material behind, so you go make a measurement and your 34-32 ratios would be higher than the source material. So you could either say, oh, okay, I misunderstand my sources, or there was some other process happening. They also do this cool thing with oxygen isotopes in particular, where bugs will reduce sulfate to sulfite, and then that'll exchange oxygen with water and get reoxidized by sulfite oxidizing organisms. So you can end up modifying the oxygen isotope composition of molecules without having any impact on the carbon cycle. So you have to watch out for that. And they also do cool things like oxygen 17 as well.
Right here. Great talk, thank you very much. I was very interested in this nice plot that shows, one effect going up, one effect going down, nature buffering herself very nicely. I'm curious if that was what you expected, and if not, what that tells you about maybe secondary effects that are going on to keep the carbon concentration of the atmosphere in balance is question number one. And question number two, which I think I know the answer to, but I'd like to make sure, an interpretation of this could be that we just don't worry about the permafrost melting anymore because it will sort itself out in, at minimum, a neutral way. And I'd like to understand if that's correct or if there are other effects that we need to be concerned about.
Yeah. Okay, did you review my recent paper? Because no, it's okay, so your first point that there are these sort of two effects, magnitude and efficiency, going in opposite directions, and then they kind of collapse and you have no impact on CO2. So the least satisfying answer is that it's a coincidence, right? And that just sort of as you thaw permafrost and you expose all of these minerals, it is just happens to be the case that you're doing a sufficient amount of enhanced silicate weathering and carbonate weathering, which are forms of weathering that decrease PCO2, that they compensate for an enhanced amount of sulfide oxidation. It seems unlikely, right? The sort of more interesting explanation might be something like sulfide oxidation generates acidity that then fuels more weathering of neighboring minerals. As long as sulfide is found in association with carbonate, which it is in most sort of siliciclastic rocks like this, that would be a reasonable thing to do. That you're sort of generating this acidity and immediately consuming it. At the same time, though, you are also thawing a lot of minerals. And as one of the things that's happening with permafrost is the tree line is advancing north. And the way that actually looks in practice is first you get shrub growth. So these shrubs, called shrubification, they're bringing new organic matter into the soil, into the sediment. So there's also just more organic carbon kicking around. So if that's getting sort of pumped down and then immediately reoxidized, then that's also a source of acidity. So it doesn't have to just be the sulfide oxidation dynamic. So those two arms, they definitely can be coupled. We can't just figure it out with what we have right now. What we need to do is actually go measure the dissolved CO2 content of the water, and that can tell you a lot about how open or closed the weathering system is. So if you know that, then you could sort of start trying to tease apart these different explanations. That data is also at the scale of the Yukon, right? So there's 6 major Arctic rivers. The Yukon is the most accessible to American scientists, and that's sort of, it's still a vast space, right? It sort of takes up 2/3 of Alaska. So what's happening in one catchment, one subcatchment is not necessarily representative of the whole thing. So the Yukon has giant mountains. It's got the White Mountains. It also has this thing called the Porcupine, which is just a big flat permafrost region. So you would like to go in on kind of a catchment by catchment level to work out those dynamics. And that'll be our second proposal going in. To your second point about sort of do we need to worry about permafrost thaw, the answer is probably still yes. And the reason for that is some of this nonlinearity. So if you think about weathering efficiency as a function of crossing PCO2 contours, I have a nice plot about this that's not in the slide deck, but essentially, as you move forward, it's going to be increasingly hard for changes in weathering magnitude to offset changes in efficiency. The last 40 years, we've been in a region where those two can be offset very efficiently. So you may only need 10% or 20% increases in magnitude to offset the change in efficiency. But going forward, that's going to be more like 50% or 100% changes in magnitude. So it does still look like this kind of permafrost, you call it, the permafrost weathering feedback, the sort of sulfide oxidation, mineral weathering feedback. These things are real. They just haven't actually manifested yet at the scale of our observations. But in 40 years, I think we'll certainly be able to see their effect on the carbon cycle.
Okay, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut it off at this point, so that we can go back on schedule. But I really want to thank Preston for presenting today.
Thank you.
And I highly encourage you to continue the conversation, through the breaks and through the rest of the workshop here.